Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Snowfall News. Sorry about the hiatus there for a little bit, but we're back again. As always, we got 3 different stories. This week, we'll be going over EA responding to backlash and capitulating. I know, a surprise from them. Then we'll be moving on over to China and seeing some of the legislation around video game ownership and specifically inheritance and how that's been shaping their side of the pond. And then lastly, we're talking about some of the rather wild backlash and drama in regards to love in Deepspace, including even sending feces to people's offices. We'll be covering all of that and more in this week's episode of Snowfall News, so let's get into it, shall we? First, EA capitulates to fan backlash in their latest sports title. Every year, EA puts out what I really can only describe as the lowest common denominator. Bottom of the barrel, the least effort yearly sports games. And it's a tradition that it's kept up for nearly as long as I can remember in the modern console age. In a lot of ways, they're rather emblematic of some of the parts I hate the most about gaming, but they make an absolute truckload of money, so what's stopping them from continuing? Well, it seems the first roadblock is here, as after a highly controversial change to the career modes in College Football 27, EA would end up relenting to player feedback and removing microtransactions from both its Dynasty mode and Road to Glory mode. Indeed, many of the microtransactions in the mode had been particularly high and frequent, in a mode that was usually rather free from this sort of monetization. The key aspect of the game where EA makes money on their sports games comes largely from online multiplayer modes, where players have to assemble a team from what are essentially gacha packs. This tends to synergize with their yearly release schedule, as players have to do all this over again with the newest title. In order to be able to reach the highest levels in the game, players had to spend upwards of $50 to $100 to keep up with rivals in a mode that was completely offline and single-player focused. Upon seeing this, the community rallied together on social media to boycott the game, as the game on its own cost $70, hitting players at a time when available cash is already thin. In a press release posted on their X account, they stated that the microtransactions were intended to give players more choice in how they progress through the game, and that they ultimately missed the mark on their intentions. They also stated that the following day they would be removing the option entirely, and that if anybody had bought points to spend, to do so immediately. And following up on that promise, they were indeed completely removed, leading to many sports gamers elated about being able to get the notoriously stubborn developer to roll back the controversial decision. I do have to admit, I was quite surprised to see this as well. Not only that, but to see it happen so quickly too. As stated, EA isn't exactly one to change in the face of feedback. And a lot of the time, why would they? It hardly affects their bottom line that much, and the series is by far one of their biggest money makers. Why change a good thing going on? It's the kind of agile response that I tend to expect from much smaller developers approaching indie-level sized teams, not one of the largest AAA developers around. It partly makes me wonder if perhaps their PR team had a crisis plan prepared for this very thing happening, and when they saw the feedback, all they had to do was put it out. As a PR person myself, this kind of thing is actually rather standard, although you don't end up seeing it in the gaming community all that often. Regardless of my skepticism, it's the first time I've seen them offer any kind of communication to their fan base, and I'll count that as a win for the players who put hundreds of hours into each of these releases. But even if they are removing their microtransactions, I can't help but wonder about the game's balancing. I think it's rather clear that the game was designed around these options. Does this mean that another patch will come to make the progression far easier? These kinds of things tend to be deeply engraved into the gameplay and progression loop of the game itself, and if they just ripped it out, you'd be left with a game that feels almost needlessly grindy. Whether or not this gets addressed as well, we'll have to see, but at the very least it's a step in the right direction. Good job, EA. I didn't think you had it in you. Next up is Chinese courts make some interesting decisions for digital inheritance, with all of the ongoing drama and discourse about the nature of digital ownership. With Sony, there's been some interesting developments and cases in China regarding it. China has always had very particular laws when it comes to gaming, from banning the distribution of certain types of games to restricting the playtime and access of games to its children. In a lot of ways, they come across as rather harsh compared to the West, but in this same way, perhaps they also seem to treat the idea of ownership in these games much more strictly as well. A Reddit user named Slarf shared a number of cases regarding digital ownership thanks in part to his own background as a Chinese English translator and his wife's access to these cases. The first of these cases he shared described a widow who had wished to inherit a valuable in-game item that apparently, due to its rarity, had real-world value that many other players were willing to pay for with real-world money. However, the item was one that was obtained through collaboration with an in-game romantic partner, and thus had belonged to his partner in-game as well. The court ended up deciding that the item belonged in part to both his wife and the in-game partner, and after it was sold, they both received exactly 50% of the profits. The second case dealt with similar digital assets that had been left behind, including bitcoins, but also his social media accounts and game account. After the person had passed away, his widow also wished to get access to all of these assets. In this case as well, all aspects that had direct economic value were transferred over to her. Of note, however, was that anything that was tied to his identity in particular, like his chat records, remained inaccessible. In the last case, the mother of a deceased gamer wanted to inherit use of 87 game accounts he had, and transfer the name linked to them in her name. This case is the most relevant, as the game company had argued directly that all users only had a limited right of use to the products, and that they were non-transferable or inheritable. Once again, in this case, the court ruled that all items that held some kind of real-world economic value and that the user agreement hadn't directly negated inheritance of property rights. What all of these cases outline first and foremost that in a Chinese court of law, there is little distinction between real life and virtual property, as long as it all holds some sort of value. In addition, the courts will argue in favor of you and against agreements made by companies as long as you can demonstrably prove the value of the items in question. It's an interesting form and take on digital ownership, but my only worry is that this thinking might only apply to the inheritance of those assets, rather than protecting them outright. For example, if the game or service that held these assets suddenly discontinued, the court cases don't really have any arguments that you should be compensated for the loss of that property. It only applies to property that exists and still holds value, and therefore can be inherited. For services like Microsoft, their policy isn't nearly as lenient when it comes to anything at all regarding the account of someone deceased. It is treated as private and cannot be touched by anyone else, usually meaning that in order for people to access it, they either have to hack the account or be given the credentials beforehand. Lastly, love, Deepspace, and BM. When it comes to gaming, I always think the demographic that's the most underserved by far is women. Despite having clearly shown that they are an economic force to be reckoned with, many companies tend to simply keep pandering to the tried and true, which is, of course, a heterosexual male audience. That's why Love in Deepspace is fascinating to me, as it proves a couple of points I've always held about the gaming community, both in the form of romance and dating sims, as well as untapped and underserved demographics within the community. And perhaps it's for this very reason that many fans of the games are rather passionate about it, as it were. Recently, Love and Deepspace had announced it would be adding a new love interest to their roster of steamy bachelors, but unfortunately for the Chinese developer, Paper Games, it wasn't going to be that simple. Fans would backlash on the announcement of the new character named Valko, mostly due to the game going through a bit of a content drought at the time. There had been a slowdown in content cadence and overall dissatisfaction with the game that many accused the new character of taking time and resources away from. However, many of the problems and concerns of the character went a bit deeper than that, as for a lot of the backlash towards them largely came from a Chinese audience. Some of the problems in relation to it came from the design of the character, which many of them deemed to be made with a lot more Western sensibilities, so much so that many of them began to question certain aspects of the character. Indeed, I don't think there's any real way to slice it. Many of them thought that Valko's much more muscular stature and design ended up making him look rather homosexual. a trait that, for a lot of the straight female audience over in China, was wholly unappealing. Alongside this, many questioned if maybe the game was going to have the option to pick a male character and have gay romances and so on. These concerns were also wrapped around various controversies, like a terribly named codex entry in the game about an experiment that was titled 731, much similar to an infamous Japanese biological weapon research facility that committed numerous atrocities to the Chinese population. All of this culminated in the company losing hundreds of thousands of followers across its accounts, but many players didn't want to leave it simply on the virtual end of things, and had taken to leaving items like cursed banners or funeral offerings and other objects outside of the office. But in the worst case scenario, some had even left cow dung in some of the lockers in the office. The whole situation is certainly rather insane, and I'm reminded a lot of the other very similar protests that revolved around gacha games, but coming from Korea. Over there, after there was a controversy with Genshin Impact, they had taken to funding an entire blimp to make their dissatisfaction known. Now, I'm all for getting attached to your waifus or husbandos and whatnot. In fact, for a game like this, that's pretty much the whole point of it, really. But to this extent, especially for those reasons, I can only be a bit astonished. In the West, I believe whenever there's this kind of situation, it very rarely spills out into real life. Take, of course, the whole Sony incident and their ceasing of physical disc production. Still, people are doing their best to protest and practically harassing the Sony pages, and for good reason, but you would never see anyone taking it so far as to go to their office and send them feces. But I can hardly blame them, I suppose, since it ended up working out in the end. With Valko no longer being released, they decided to cancel his development, and they promised that they would instead be putting more thought and more time into getting the other bachelors their time to shine. Whether or not this ends up appeasing the fan base has yet to be seen, but it seems that they were more than happy with this conclusion, at least on the Chinese side. Many people in the West are still rather sad about Valko not being officially released, and are hoping to see perhaps some concession in the future. So that'll do it for this week's episode, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Sorry again for the late release, but we'll be back again on a regular schedule, so I'll see you guys next time. Bye, guys.